Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to If It Ain't Broke, You Can Still Fix It. Today, we're going to jump into Slate's workflow editor and talk about how you can transition into this module from the current reader tools, how you can expand beyond the standard use cases for it, and just generally some tips and tricks to keep in mind as we're moving through it. So, but to get started, let's take a look at our roadmap for this webinar. First, we're going to go over an overview. What is workflows? What are they? How do we use them within Slate? How do they differ from the reader tool which you've been using up to this point? Some tips and tricks around transitioning into the new tool. And then also at the very end, we're going to go through some fun examples of enhancements, ways to take what you've been doing and expand on it and take it to the next degree. Quick tip for the third section today is that there will be a suitcase ID on screen. And so for Slate users who may not be familiar with Suitcase, this is a tool which allows you to copy elements from one instance into another. And this will be on the bottom of the screen for the entirety of the third section of this webinar. And just what that means is you can jot down that ID and use it to transport in any of the items we're talking about that are suitcaseable into your instance to play around with. So when we get to that section, don't be afraid to jot that down so you can take some things home with you. But to get started, you probably want to know who you're going to be hearing from today. My name is Rocco Percelio, and I'm a senior Slate Student Success Implementation Strategist. I've been a Slate user since 2017 and been with Carnegie since February of 2022.
I'm Ryan Simpson. I'm a Slate Enrollment Implementation Strategist. I've been a Slate user since 2017, and I've been at Carnegie since November of 2021.
And I'm Justin Pierce, also a Slate Enrollment Implementation Strategist, been using Slate since 2015 and been at Carnegie since May of 2022. And today we're going to be talking about the use of the workflow tool in two situations: transitioning an existing process from reader legacy tool into the new workflow, and bringing external processes into Slate that go beyond application review. But before we do, we want to make sure that we're being clear about our terms and the different tools that we'll be looking at and using. So the reader refers to the module or the tool designed for reading applications and other processes. You see the icon there on the screen. It's in the middle of your screen when you're logged into Slate. Brings you to that environment that looks just a little bit different, where you see your process. The reader legacy tools, which is where you would build your process for the reader, are now all grayed out. They say legacy tool in the database configurations, and that's the pre-existing legacy tool discouraged by Technolutions in favor of building in workflows. Where our workflow is that all-in-one environment that's used for creating and managing reader workflows. And so bringing all of those different legacy tools together in one place with some enhancements. So the reader is where the work is done, and the workflow is the back-end process that you use to create that process. And so why should we be transitioning to workflow? If you have something that's built in the reader legacy tools, if you're working in the reader actively, why is it worth taking the time to focus on this, to transition to the new workflow and use this tool? And a couple of reasons: the benefits of the tool itself, the all-in-one environment, drag and drop functionality means no longer having to get matching naming conventions and getting all of these different screens up on your monitors to make sure everything is matching. It's much easier to build. Which also means it's much easier to maintain as things need to be updated, as you troubleshoot issues and need to make changes or to figure out where things have gone wrong. It's a lot easier to do. It will save you a lot of time in the long run. As you bring in processes into Slate, it becomes easier with staff training to be clear about how things should work and the order that they should happen in. In addition, you'll hear later on about some really cool enhancements that we can show you when it comes to displaying information. Data containers only are available in the workflow editor, some advanced portaling options, as well as updating information, moving beyond review forms when it's appropriate to do so, with some different enhancements there. And so we also want to go through tips for transitioning to that new workflow. And so first, the first thing is build on your own timeline. What's great is that a new workflow can exist concurrently with your legacy reader build. So if you're already using something in the legacy tool, don't worry, you can keep using it. Your end users can keep using it as you're doing the build in the back end, building that workflow to update your process, which means you don't just need to rebuild something. Transitioning to the new workflow is a great time to rethink processes, make improvements. And the way you can make sure that not everyone is seeing this in-process build is by adding a custom permission to it, only providing that permission to users who need to be part of the build before giving that access to everyone when it's ready to go live. So talking about go live, make sure you have a plan. Identify a low volume, either time of year, time of day, that you're going to go ahead and make that transition. And then once you come up with a plan, once you come up with a date, stick to it. Commit to making that transition and getting yourself into the new workflow. Make sure that you go in and inactivate the default application reader via the application's query base. That's how you'll turn off the old reader that you're using in favor of the new workflow that you're building. And then you can go ahead and update the workflow permission, either updating the permission on the workflow you've built or providing that custom permission to everyone who needs to be able to see this new workflow. When it comes to the application files, we recommend using queries to use batch management tools so that you can move things over in batch. That means clearing existing queue assignments, as well as moving to their corresponding bins in the new workflow. You can do that all at once with queries and batch management, so you're not individually moving over files one at a time. You'll also want to ensure that your files run through your rules so that they get picked up with any reader or queue assignment automation that you've built. Going ahead and moving your applications to the new bins should run them through those rules, but something to keep in mind. And then you'll want to use a series of audit queries just to check yourself, make sure that everything's in the right spot, all the assignments are correct, make sure that you go through and just give it a double check. And if you do all of these things right, the transition will be seamless. You can let your end users know, your counselors, faculty, staff, whomever is in your workflow, know that there might be a downtime as you're making this transition, but it should be a pretty limited amount of time because this is going to be a seamless process for you. And the last thing to keep in mind is as you're building your workflow, you're going to be able to have a view to show key information when you click on a bin, similar to what you have now. When you build that workflow, you're going to get a default view that's going to be created for you. Just a reminder to go into that view and actually click the button to set it as the default view. So you're getting all of the information available to you when you click into a bin. And with all of that, you should be able to move forward with that workflow build.
Great, thanks, Justin. So now that you've transitioned from the legacy reader to the new workflow, we can talk about some of the enhancements that you're going to get. Our first enhancement would be data containers. So for example, we're going to talk about transcript metadata and different ways to display information to help you clearly parse your transcripts. You can also use portal displays. So you can show SIS screens right in Slate via the reader. You can also use aggregate data to shape your class. And as Justin mentioned, aside from your default view, you can also create shared views. These are going to allow you to pre-sort your files so you can prioritize your work, and you can also filter out different files so you can hide and show specific groups by default by user. So building a data container. Creating a data container is as easy as adding a material to a tab. It's a specific kind of material that allows you to select your scope. For most data containers, you can select the scope of the object that you want to display. In this case, we're going to be talking about academic history, so we're going to select school. For each school in the student record, you're going to get a new page, and we define what's on the page by building out our exports, as we can see here on the left. We can create sections, which create new pages. So we can see on the right, we've got academic history page 1, and we can also create headers, which create those nice gray lines. And we're using, in this example, the level of study. Additionally, you can add in institution, location, degree, etc. In this example, we've actually combined multiple pages into one. But if you use the scope of school or job or relationship, you would actually get one page per row in that situation. Another example here is creating a metadata view. So as we click through the interface for our data container, we can actually add documents to the data container itself. So what we've done is created a custom page that precedes our transcripts, and it gives you the metadata and information about the university that the transcript is for. If you've ever used online transcript services, sometimes you get transcripts that come through and it's unclear as to which transcript you're looking at. These provide page breaks and valuable information ahead of time so you know what you're looking at. And finally, as we mentioned before, we've got shared views. So rather than building queries and saving them to the reader folder as you used to do in the legacy reader, what we have now is an option within the workflow interface to create these views. As you can see here, it's as easy as adding exports to create your columns. We can also add filters to limit what's viewed by the user. Additionally, as you can see here, we can also add permissions. So you can grant specific views to specific users within your instance. As Justin mentioned, though, there is a very important button to click. You have to have a default. So we can see up here, there's a default view. So at least one of your views needs to be selected as that so that folks can see things as they log in.
Perfect. So seeing information in Reader is very important. Obviously, as we're reviewing applications, we need to understand the full context of a student record, and viewing that data is really important. But there are going to become moments as you build out more processes into workflows beyond standard application review, where just seeing information may not be enough to fully accommodate your process. There may be opportunities for or reasons that you need to update student data while you're reviewing or while you're using the Reader tool. And there hasn't traditionally been ways to easily, within Reader itself, update information on a student record beyond what's covered within your Reader review form. And that can be very limited. So we're going to walk through some examples together of how to take the new workflow tool and build in some enhancements that allow you to, without leaving the Reader environment, update student information directly as part of your processing. So the examples we're going to walk through are going to include transcript processing, school updates, those types of things. The skills that you'll need, the requisite skills in order to implement these enhancements, are going to include basic understandings of query string parameters, some liquid markup knowledge, some general information about portals, and loose familiarity with CSS and HTML. Luckily for you folks, what's included in our suitcase is pre-formatted with some basic structures that should be easy for you to extrapolate your processes onto. So you don't need to have a full robust knowledge of all of these topics in order to implement these, because you're being provided with the scaffolding for these. Also, at the end of this, there is going to be a resources slide which links to the knowledge base articles that we've used to learn about and create these enhancements. So you folks can reference those just like we do as we're implementing these in instances every day. The last thing I'll say before we start looking at these examples is that each and every one of these examples came from working with a real world partner that we work with. And these are born out of the needs for their processes. So while the examples we're working through don't necessarily exactly match your processes, we're hoping that you can see some part of that in the examples we walk through today and get the gears turning on how you can enhance your own workflow environments. So with that, let's jump over to our examples. Like I said, we're going to walk through transcript processing, which uses a combination of review forms, dictionary exports, and query string parameters. We're also going to talk about how to access a Slate record as a Reader tab without leaving that environment, and how you can access and update information that way. And our last example is born out of the example of a GPA recalculation, but the images we have are from kind of a simpler form, but again, using a Reader portal and query string parameters. So the first one, like I said, we're going to talk about transcript processing. And this utilizes something called a pop-up form, which is always fun, which you can see in this image here. There is an optional review form that, when you select, uses a dictionary export and liquid markup looping to generate a list of all of the schools on the student record. And from those, a unique link which you can click, which uses query string parameters to load a form which has all of the distinguishing information about that school pre-rendered and preloaded on that form. It's preloaded with all of the information that's necessary for default matching onto school rows within Slate, but you could also pass over the school GUID or unique identifier to assure that it's matching onto the correct row rather than leveraging Slate's default matching criteria. And this is a really useful tool because we all know that as you're working through transcripts or as you're working through other materials, you may have to correct some information that a student inadvertently entered incorrectly on an application or was imported potentially through another source, a third party, that needs to be updated or corrected. You can now do that directly in time with your processing without leaving the workflow environment. So just a fun enhancement here that allows you to be a little bit more dynamic in your processing. Our next example that we're going to take a look at is going to be, again, accessing a record tab directly within Reader. Now, what we're going to be leveraging here is a fun fact about Slate, which is that all tabs in Slate on a student's record have a default URL format. And the only unique characteristic of the URL for each of those tabs is the student GUID, the student's unique ID within Slate. So if you have access to the student GUID, you can recreate the URL to any of their tabs anywhere that you need to link back to that or to include it in an iframe. And an iframe is a simple tool that just basically allows you to display a section or the entirety of a URL that you link within that iframe. What we're using to power this is just a portal, a very, very basic reader portal, the same way you would set up a reader dashboard for which there is tremendous documentation in the knowledge base. But all we did was add an iframe to a static content block and point it to in this case, the materials tab of a student record, again, using query string parameters in our embed, so that this iframe is pointing to the correct students tab. And now if you look closely, you can see that in real time, I'm accessing the material pop-up, I'm changing the material name, and in real time, it's changing on the student record. This again is great for material cleanup, material processing, those types of things. But we've also used this in cases where we have an entity widget on a student record on its own special tab, and we now can have real-time edits to that entity table as well. One thing I will point out that's a shortcoming of this, because you may notice we're kind of having Slate live inside of Slate, live inside of Slate. So we're pushing this to the end of the technical boundaries of what was intended within Slate. And so there are some, we'll say, oddities with this setup. One being you can notice the save button works totally fine. The close button works totally fine. One interesting nuance we've discovered with this setup is that the delete button does not function, which honestly is kind of a handy safeguard so people aren't accidentally deleting information. That's the only shortcoming that we've identified at that point. Our next example Our next example we're going to take a look at, again, was born out of the idea of having a GPA recalculation available during the reader review process, but not integral to it, not in a required component. Many of you have probably set up reader review forms set up to encapsulate GPA recalculation. So as part of your reader review, you have a GPA calculator built right in. But what if the GPA recalculation is not inherent to the reader review process? You don't necessarily need or want your reviewers to have a registered log of that GPA recalculation, but you need GPAs to be recalculated maybe for scholarship purposes or for some type of affinity groups or something along those lines. You still want the GPAs recalculated, but not stored as an inherent part of the review process. What we can do is leverage portals and query string parameters to create a tab which embeds a form as a reader material, but it's interactive. So you can see here, this is just a simple RFI form where someone can go in and update this form and submit it on behalf of the student. It's a pretty simple process, just using, again, a simple portal, just like you would for a reader dashboard, and then using an embed URL that's generated by Slate on the form itself, and then tossing a quick query string parameter to either the student or application GUID, depending on the scope of the form, so that it is associated with the correct student or correct application. This again just allows you to have another input method beyond the standard reader review form. And it allows you to be able to additionally have a form that kind of follows a student through the reader review process. You can see a submit button on screen right now, but after you hit submit the first time, if you don't set this base form to be multiple in the form configurations, each user that has access to this tab can then edit this form as it's in subsequent bins. This could be a way for you to have if there is a form that needs to be completed by multiple reviewers throughout a process, or maybe like a traveling document that documents the steps that are taken in each bin throughout a process. This is a way that you can facilitate that, where previously reader review forms did not accommodate well the ability for data to move from one bin to another in an editable fashion. This allows you to be able to do that. So just a fun way to go beyond the traditional functionalities of review forms. And again, if GPA recalculation isn't exactly what you're looking for, if having a traveling form isn't exactly what you're looking for, just think creatively about this and the other enhancements we've walked through, and try to extrapolate them into your various processes. So as promised, here are the resources that we've used to create these enhancements that we were demonstrating today. Genuinely, 90% of what went into building these came from these knowledge base articles. Highly recommend referencing them as you're working to implement the enhancements we've walked through today. I do every single day. So feel free to leverage these as you're working through those. With that, nothing else to say, but thank you for tuning in. Again, the suitcase ID is on center screen right here. So if you want to take some of these items home with you, feel free to jot that down. We'll linger a little bit on this page to make sure that you you can grab that long string of characters for use. But again, just thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you can find a use for these enhancements and these tips and tricks in your processes.